All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Privacy Exchange Communities Show and Tell show with our special guest, Stephen Lappenbusch. This is part two of a two-part series with Steve on the topic of data brokers. So in our session today with Steve, we're going to get a glimpse of data brokering from the inside, and we'll be discussing how data brokers should be operationalizing compliance with California's Delete Act. Steve leads privacy and compliance and has worked for data brokers for almost 20 years. So he is an expert in this area, and we're honored to have him on the show. Before he worked in data brokering, he ran an academic research unit, did research on user experience, sales, and product. Okay, so here's how we're going to spend the next 25 minutes or so together. First, Steve and I will have a chat for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will turn off the recording and open it up for audience Q&A. So as a reminder, before we get in there, the information in today's session is for general purposes only, and it is not legal advice. Contact your own attorney if you need legal advice. Also, Steve is here today in his personal capacity and is not speaking on behalf of his employer. All right, Steve, with all of that behind us, are you ready to hop in?
Absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, my first question, Steve, is I'd like to know a little bit more about the history of how the data broker industry got started and how it's grown in the last handful of years, especially because you've got 20 years of visibility on this. And why I'm asking is to better understand and contextualize how the California Delete Act came to be.
Right. Well, I guess it depends on how far back you want to go, right? But I think the modern way in which we all think about it, it really started to heat up way back in the 50s when the credit bureaus started really spinning up profiles on people, and those were used to make some pretty impactful decisions. If you fast forward then to the early 70s, that's when they passed the FCRA, and that created a very specific kind of data broker around credit decisioning, which became the credit bureaus. Now, if you keep going from there, especially in the 80s and then into the 90s, just before I dropped into the industry, a number of companies would then buy pieces of the credit report and then put that together with public records. And that's where you got what are still some of the biggest data brokers in the world today still sort of operate in that way. And from there, once the internet really took off from an e-commerce standpoint, you had a third category of data brokers, right? So you've got FCRA, you got the bureaus and other credit reporting agencies. You've got brokers that put together pieces of the credit report, the credit header, and then public records. And then you've got brokers that primarily focus on people's online lives. So you've got those three categories that created, but I would say by the early 2000s, all three of those created, and that's what's carried through today. You can still see different brokers fall into one of those three buckets primarily. Now, how that impacts what's going on with California and their redefinition of data broker is that there's just activities across all three of those that sort of the traditional idea of a third-party data broker doesn't really cover the whole ground of data brokering. And I think California looked around and said they needed to do something a little different to make sure that they fulfilled as much of their mandate as they could to regulate data brokering for Californians.
Interesting. Well, and so we know that California's law is new and novel. Why are they doing something different at all? And how is it different from how other states are regulating data brokers or not?
Well, I think, so California started regulating data brokers in the United States sooner than anyone else. So I just think that they're a little further along in the evolution. That's just sort of inevitable, right? If you start first, you progress to further down the road faster than anybody else. What they're doing that's different is, again, they sort of looked around at data brokering as a whole, not just at those who call themselves data brokering, but the activity as a whole, and they realized they were missing a lot. So I use the phrase third-party data brokers versus first-party data brokers. And third-party data brokers are those that you sort of typically think of, right? In a lot of the statutes and regs, it's written as, does not have a direct personal relationship with the consumer. That's what we think of. But California looked at it and said, look, a lot of the largest privacy violations that we're enforcing and that we're seeing are not with those businesses. They're with really large, say, social media platforms or, e-commerce or these days car manufacturers and insurance companies. And none of those fit into that, but they were by any common sense definition, they seem to be brokering data. And so what they did is they changed their regulatory interpretation of the Delete Act to say, okay, look, you can have a first party relationship, that's fine. But if you also sell, and by the California definition of selling, sell data about that same person that you didn't get from that person, right? So if you mix in some second or third party data with that first party and then you monetize that, that's data brokering now in California. Well, that seems like a small change, but if you think about all of the tech businesses out there that do that kind of thing, it now means a lot of those businesses are within scope of data brokering or maybe in scope of data brokering, and that's a big change for them.
That is super fascinating. And what something that's always confounded me so far is how few companies have actually signed up for the data broker registry, which has been around for a handful of years. Do you think there's like a misunderstanding of companies that may not actually believe they're data brokers? And how do we
Very
fix
much
that?
so. Very much so. And I think now with the expansion of the definition, I think we're really going to see that. So California got, I think the number is 496 companies registering. That's a lot of companies, but there are way more companies that mix together first and third party data and push it out in some kind of a product in the United States than 496. Way more. And I think it's not anybody evading it. I just don't think that they're aware. And I don't think that if they are aware, I think that they have an immediate reaction of, oh, that's not us, without turning around and looking at it and proving it's not them.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So there's an awareness campaign that needs to happen amongst the companies themselves that, just because you didn't traditionally fall in this camp doesn't mean your business practices aren't such of what this law is suggesting.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the Delete Act requirements, and how that might impact how data brokers actually collect data and their business models. So I'm kind of curious your take on how that law will be changing data broker businesses, how they may be changing their operational practices. What's your take?
I think, well, first, I think nobody knows, really, of course, right? But I would imagine that you're going to see a small period of freak out, right? A little bit, people sort of running around with their hands in the air trying to figure things out, and then things will calm down a little bit because this has happened a couple of times already in my career. The do not call list was an example. When FCRA was applied to public records brokers, that was another example of where the market needed to figure itself out and adjust. And as you say, the practices of businesses needed to change. I think that in terms of the drop, as they call it, the deletion mechanism that California is building, I'm not sure anybody realizes or understands yet what the operational requirements of that are going to be. They've published it in sort of concept, but really when the rubber meets the road and you've got to push data back and forth, nobody really knows how well that's going to work or how well it's going to work for all 496 companies that have to do it. That's a monumental undertaking that they're doing there. If, as a former data product leader, if you came to me with those requirements, I would say, no, I'm not going to build that. So they've undertaken something very, very big and very serious. And they're intent on pulling it off. They're reaching out to stakeholders to refine their requirements. They're taking it very seriously. But nobody knows how it's really going to work. But what I will say is, in terms of the collection, this will work itself out. And so the example that comes to mind, honestly, which is maybe a weird example, but is true, is if you think back to the Cambridge Analytica debacle, right? Where I don't remember the number, I think it was 30 or 40 or some millions of Facebook users had their information siphoned out by Cambridge Analytica, and we all know how that turned out. What gets lost in that story, though, is that those tens of millions of people all came from about 250,000 people who did opt in to this. They said, in return for taking a survey and seeing the results, as I recall, yeah, you can use my data. 250,000 people said yes to that. What will happen if the data brokering activity is required to get more first person relationships is people will just figure out a way to do that. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're a fan of first party consent, then you really are putting it entirely on the consumer. Do you want your data collected? And I think for a long time in the industry, there were data brokers, I'll just say it that way, who leverage things like the SDKs to get data out of the various apps on your phone. And users maybe weren't super aware that was happening. I think what something like this might do is surface that up to the top so the users are aware it's happening. And the truth is, unlike those of us in privacy, a lot of people are going to say, fine, I want to move the brightly colored lights around on my phone while I'm sitting on the bus. And in return, you can have my contact information and even my location information. I'm good with that. That I think is an inevitable result, sort of an unintended consequence of sort of squeezing the regulatory balloon in this way. Now, I also think, so for example, my home state of Oregon, there's a bill that's been proposed where no sensitive personal data will be allowed to be sold. And the phrase with or without consent is in that bill. So I think all of these things are coming together at the same time. In the next 2 or 3 years, companies are going to have a little more stability. But until then, there's going to be a lot of companies trying to figure this out, and nobody's going to have the right answer. We're just going to have to figure it all out together.
Wow, I hadn't thought about, and I like your analogy of squeezing the regulatory balloon. It's going to come out in a different way. I hadn't thought about how that will impact companies' willingness to go get the first party consent, be more transparent. So, I mean, I personally think transparency should have been there all along. But yeah, to see how that changes afterwards. I've seen similar reports where many people are okay with sharing their data in some sort of value exchange, but I think just like the hiding of that is was problematic. So interesting thoughts on that, Steve. Okay, question. We talked about how companies like are not the ones that don't traditionally think of themselves as data brokers. What should they be thinking about like internally? Like if we have a privacy pro who's watching this and says, "Oh no, what should I be thinking about if this may apply to me? Like what questions should they be asking their teams? What sort of requirements should they be looking into? What should they be doing to take that first step to comply with the California law?"
Yeah. So I think there's a real silver lining in all of this for just about any privacy professional and all of their colleagues. And that is it invites the privacy person to really double down and focus on the most important question in any business, which is how do we make money? And the reason I say that is that that forces you to say, what are we selling to customers? What are customers buying from us really? Right. And I don't mean from a brand perspective. I mean from a nuts and bolts, what's the data going back and forth perspective? And because we spend a lot of time, talking about how we need to map the data in our environment, and all that's true. But what this does is it invites privacy professionals to go, okay, wait a minute. I know it's in my various S3 buckets or whether we use SES for email or all this. I got all that. What are we shipping in terms of data? And what are those people doing with it? Companies that have never really asked themselves those questions because they've never thought of themselves that way, this forces them to do that. And so just sit down with your product team and say, okay, this product has data in it. We send data to people. Where are we getting that data? Is it only from the consumer? Or are we mixing it with data from a broker? Or are we creating metadata out of the data that we have? Because if it's metadata, that's second party data, you didn't get that from the consumer either. So I really think that's going to fall in scope of calling yourselves a broker. And a ton of businesses create metadata out of their first party data as they should. But then they usually then combine that with third party data. So that's the question you have to have is you get a really close with your product team and start talking about what data gets shipped and where does it come from? What is the provenance of the data in your products to put it in a really concise sentence?
Yeah. So I like this. This is a really an expansion of the standard data mapping task that the privacy team deals with. It's not just about knowing what data you have, but what's monetized, what's I guess shared, sold. What's the product? So that's great advice to add to the privacy pros up their sleeve with their next steps for the year ahead. One last question, Steve, before we open it up to audience Q&A. And I did ask you this last time, and I thought your answer was interesting. So I'm going to ask you again. What is something that people probably don't know about data brokers that they maybe should?
Well, I'm probably going to give a different answer, so I hope we don't compare the answers. But what I what I will say is, I think I have a two-part answer, and one is around people's professional lives, and one is around their personal lives. And the professional life answer is that it's very, very likely, particularly if you work for a business of any significant size, and definitely if you work for, say, somebody in the Fortune 1000, it is very, very likely that that business is licensing data from what I hope is a registered data broker. Those companies are so big, they do so many things with data that, data science, with marketing, whatever it is, it's very likely they're bringing that data in from a broker. And so what I would say is when you, as a privacy professional, think about data brokers, realize that those data brokers are supporting the business that's supporting you and your customers. It's part of what I call, again, the privacy supply chain. Now, if you find those data brokers and you realize, wait, I haven't really, as a privacy person, I haven't really done any diligence on them because you just never thought to think of it in terms of that data coming in, then there are ways that you can structure some questions to do some due diligence on them. And we can we've talked about creating a resource for folks, and I think we should do that. So that's in your professional life. Realize that the data economy isn't going away. If you work for a business of appreciable size, that business is probably right licensing data. Now, on the personal side, I would say there's a lot of people who say, how do I get my data out of the stream? And to a certain extent, I would say that unless you're really going to go all the way off the grid, that seems really hard to do. Like, I don't think it's achievable. I, for example, have never had a social media account except LinkedIn. Never had it. Now, this is where people make jokes about, maybe I'm a little older and I can get away with that. But, a whole bunch of people in my social circle, they're all on social media. I don't do it for reasons germane to privacy. So I would say from a personal standpoint, if you're worried about which data broker has your data, worry about the data you're creating in the stream, because that's what you can really control more than anything else. Don't sign up for loyalty programs you're not going to use. Stay off social media if you really don't need it. Most people have at least one or two platforms they really could get rid of, right? I mean, if you're under 30, do you really need your Facebook account? Let's be honest. And those are the two things that I think are most important. And the third thing is, honestly, if you want to try and get your data out of data brokers, I would look very closely at where you're going to go in your life next, because one of the things that is sort of not understood is if you're going to look for a job, one of the things that recruiters do more than anything else is they use third-party data to find people for opportunities. So if you take yourself out of that stream, you're taking yourself out of that market. And that may not be a good idea given what the job market is right now. So there's all sorts of unintended consequences, and I think people should think those through in their personal lives and in their professional life as a privacy person. Track down where your data brokers are in your vendor system and start asking some questions.
Wonderful. Well, we'll leave it at that for the this session of our talk. Thank you so much, Steve.